Hello everyone. Today I want to discuss about scope of variables in Python. Scope in general it means a lifespan. So lifespan of variables in Python it is called as scopes of variables. Lifespan of a human being is generally 100 years. Likewise for a dog it is between 12 to 13 years. So here scope means a lifespan. There are different types of scopes for variables. There are four types of scopes in Python, that is local scope, enclosing scope, global scope, and built-in scope. Local scope where the variable it is defined within a function and it is accessed only in that function. We cannot access the variable which is defined within that function in the outer function. So the scope of that variable here called as local scope, and the variable which is defined as a local variable it gets deleted after execution of that function. Here for example I've defined a function local example and x is equal to 10. So here x is a local variable, and the scope of that variable is only within this function. We cannot access that variable in the outer functions. And the next is enclosing scope. Enclosing scope is it is usually the variable which is defined in the outer function is accessible in the inner function. The scope of that variable called as enclosing scope, and we can only access the variable which is defined in the outer function. We can only access it in the inner function, and we can also not access that variable outside of that function. Here for example I took y equal to 50 and it is an enclosing variable where it is scopes is enclosing scope, and I defined an inner function. Here it is a nested function and I defined an inner function, and I'm accessing the enclosing scope variable in the inner function. So this type of scope is known as the enclosing scope. We define variables accessible to the inner functions, accesses variables from outer scope. And the next goes to global scope. Global variable is defined outside of the function, and it can be accessed throughout that function, throughout the program. Not only a function, we can access a global variable throughout the program. We can use it is in the functions, in the modules within that program. We can access throughout the program. And if we define any variable as a global variable in a particular function, then we can modify that variable within that function. And next goes to built-in scope. Here built-in scope is the widest, and it is the largest scope in the Python. And we won't import and we won't define it. Like the examples of built-in scope is print function, length function, type function. So we do not import it from anywhere, and we won't declare that functions like variables, like the variables we defined in the before scope. Here we won't define any print function or length function or type function. We can directly access that function, that modules is predefined functions. The built-in scope is predefined functions or built-in functions or built-in modules. And Python usually follows LEGB rule cycle. If we define any variable, it checks whether the variable belongs to the local scope, and then it checks if it is not in the local scope, then it goes into the next scope, that is enclosing scope. Even it is not there in the enclosing scope, it goes to the global scope. After that, at last it's checked in the built-in scope. So the Python usually follows the LEGB rule for checking the variables and for accessing the variables. Thank you.